So welcome to the second annual Talk Change Conference. It's an initiative of Smart Solutions in partnership with the Ivy Political and Economic Issues Club. My name is Sharifa, and I'm the chair of Smart Solutions here at Western. So before we get into the bulk of the conference, I'd just like to briefly mention what Smart Solutions is all about. So Smart Solutions' mandate is to raise awareness, promote discussion, and provide opportunities for post-sec students just like yourselves in relation to sustainable and long-term solutions to issues in the developing world. So innovation is really at the heart of what Smart Solutions is all about, and Talk Change is a channel through which our mandate can be realized. So what makes Talk Change different from every other conference? For one, it's run entirely by students. Secondly, Talk Change aims to provide not only inspiration, but also a call to action for students like yourselves to go out and create your own smart solutions. So myself and the other organizers of this conference really hope that you will gain a lot of insight into innovative practices in international development throughout the course of the day. And so without further ado, I'm going to ask Avi to introduce our keynote speaker.
Hey everyone, I'm Avi. Welcome to the keynote address. We can't tell you how honored we are to have Professor Sachs here with us today via Skype. He's video chatting with us from Hong Kong, I believe. Welcome, Professor. Thank you for being here. This is your opportunity to hear his take on the progress being made to eliminate extreme forms of poverty entirely. This will also be your chance to pose your questions to Professor Sachs on an array of different issues. There will be cue cards in your participant packages or slips of paper that you can write your question down on. And when you do have a question during the speech or during the Q&A period, just put up your hand with the paper, and our two volunteers, Noreen, who's right over there, and Shrifa, we'll just go around and we'll be collecting the questions from you. Just make sure you pass it down to the ends of the aisle. So the speech will last about 30 minutes, and the Q&A period will last about 30 minutes also, so you'll get a lot of opportunity to ask your questions. So, before I read out Professor Sachs's bio, I thought that I should let you know that there were a few people who were unfamiliar with Professor Sachs's work and who asked me about his significance. Specifically, what's so important about Professor Sachs? Why are you promoting this so hard? And the way I explained it was, and I used an analogy, largely because I didn't memorize his bio. It's a really long bio. I used an analogy. I said that, and I say this with all due respect, Professor Sachs. He's kind of like the Lady Gaga of international development. And I say that because, I think it's accurate, because just as Lady Gaga has challenged what we traditionally thought was acceptable and possible for an artist to achieve in the music industry, Professor Sachs has challenged what we traditionally thought was possible for humanity to achieve. His book, The End of Poverty, The Economic Possibilities of Our Time, kind of empirically showed that the end of extreme forms of poverty is potentially a possible thing. So on to his bio now. He is the director of the Earth Institute, Quitt-Lett Professor of Sustainable Development, and Professor of Health Policy and Management at Columbia University. He is also Special Advisor to the United Nations Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon. From 2002 to 2006, he was Director of the UN Millennium Project and Special Advisor to the United Nations General Secretary Kofi Annan on the Millennium Development Goals, the internationally agreed upon goals to reduce extreme poverty, as many of you may know. Sachs is also president and co-founder of Millennium Promise Alliance, a nonprofit organization, dedicated to ending extreme forms of global poverty. And for more than 20 years, Professor Sachs has been in the forefront of the challenge of economic development and poverty alleviation. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Jeffrey Sachs.
Thanks a lot. I don't know if I can live up to the Lady Gaga moniker, but I will do my best to live up to being a participant in your important gathering and to talk to you about the Millennium Development Goals and to have a chance to brainstorm together with you. The Millennium Development Goals, as you mentioned, David, are the internationally agreed goals to fight poverty, hunger, and disease. And I've been involved with them pretty much from the start now. They were set in 2000, and they have a 15-year time horizon. When the international leaders gathered at the UN at the start of the new millennium in September 2000, they said that they would undertake jointly to pursue the reduction of poverty and to make some very bold and specific advances by the year 2015. So we're in the home stretch of the Millennium Development Goals. It's been a fascinating and I think important process, and for me, quite a fascinating one, because Secretary General Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General of the UN at the time of the Millennium Development Goals, and indeed was really the person who put them in front of the world's leaders, asked me in 2001 whether I could help the UN to come up with some practical strategies to achieve these goals. In other words, can they be something more than a nice objective, something more than nice words on a page? Could they actually become a kind of blueprint, or could there be a blueprint to actually achieve them? And it's quite a good assignment to get, a very good homework assignment. What are the practical things that can be done to change the face of global poverty? When the goals were set, and one of the things that I really like about them is that they named measurable and stretch goals. So when they talked about reducing poverty, they defined it. In this case, of the 8 Millennium Development Goals, goal number 1 is about poverty per se. And it says that the rate of poverty, meaning the proportion of households living below the international poverty line, should fall by 1/2. Whatever your country's poverty rate was in 1990, by 2015, the poverty rate should be no more than half of the 1990 rate. And similarly, hunger is also part of goal number 1. Whatever your country's hunger rate is, and there are many different definitions of hunger, but one of them is that the children are not reaching a proper height for their age. In other words, they're stunted. That rate of hunger should fall by half by the year 2015 compared to the rate of 1990. And so for each of these goals, specific and measurable targets were made, and that poses a pretty interesting challenge. And that is what could be done to kind of pick up the pace of history so that big progress could be made and actually reach the finish line for as many countries as possible having achieved the Millennium Development Goals. Now, I've been at this myself for a decade now, since 2001. And I have to tell you, the world is a pretty troubled and unstable place, as I'm sure you appreciate day to day. There aren't too many things that the world agrees on. And of the few things that the world agrees on, there aren't too many things that the world actually follows through on. So we hear a lot of words from our politicians, but we don't really see much consistency and much honesty in even pursuing what they say, much less actually achieving what they say. When it comes to international things like the Millennium Development Goals, the world is really so distracted. Each country has its own crises, its own politics, almost always issues of war outpace and draw attention away from issues of development. things like the Millennium Development Goals can easily get completely lost in the mix. So the first thing that for me has been interesting over this 10-year period is that we still talk about the Millennium Development Goals. It's one of the very few parts of the United Nations system. Something was said 11 years ago. By the way, I think you moved the computer close to the mic, so I'm hearing an echo right now. It was fine a moment ago. Thank you. Not that I don't want to see you other guys, but I was hearing myself talk. So the Millennium Development Goals, I'm convinced when they were actually announced in September 2000, I think the world leaders thought they'd never hear of them again. They stood up for a wonderful photo opportunity. There was a picture of 163 world leaders standing in front of their flags. But I don't think that they really took seriously these goals and that they expected them to have a kind of continuing life. But here we are in 2011, and the first thing I want to tell you is that the goals are actually very much alive. Not in the United States, and not very much in Canada, though on our campuses they are. But in 4 countries, they really have become a kind of rallying cry of civil society, and they've really become a benchmark or a measurement tool of government. I find this amazing, frankly, because, again, it's so easy to state goals and then forget them. We do that all the time. We do that with climate change. We do that with biodiversity. We do that with nuclear proliferation. So many things. We just stage words, but then they have no lifespan beyond the photo opportunity. But here we are really 11 years after the Millennium Development Goals were set. I've been at it intensively pretty much day to day for 10 years. And I see them really having a life. Now the second thing is just to understand where we really are on these goals and what it is that the project that I led recommended and what's happened with all of them. So there are 8 goals. Broadly speaking, the 8th goal is a goal that says the world should coordinate to achieve the first 7 goals. And those 7 goals start with the fight against poverty and hunger, goal number 1. And goal number 2 is that all children should complete a primary education. Goal number 3 is that there should be gender equality, with a lot of attention paid to boys and girls having the same enrollment and completion rates at all levels of education. Goal number 4 is to cut sharply child mortality, in other words, the proportion of children who die before the 5th birthday. Goal number 5 is about maternal health, and the main part of it is to reduce very sharply, indeed by 3/4, the proportion of births that end up in the death of the mother. Goal number 6 is a goal to combat the pandemic diseases. And when the year 2000 came and the new millennium started, the AIDS pandemic was completely out of control, almost no control at all. And there were 25 million or so Africans HIV infected, and extraordinary number of deaths in the millions every year. And so goal number 6 put a lot of focus on on AIDS control, also malaria, which was running out of control, tuberculosis, and other epidemic diseases. That also includes a lot of awful kinds of infectious diseases like worm infections. And goal number 7 is about environmental sustainability. That's a very big theme and very little achieved in the world. Specific parts of it that have been the focus of Millennium Development Goals include access to safe water, access to sanitation, toilets basically, and a safe environment for human sanitation, and also improvements in the conditions in slums. in which more than 1 million people around the world live. So these are the 7 main goals. Goal number 8, as I said, is about partnership to achieve that, and also partnership to spread technologies like information technology to poorer countries so that they can benefit from the advances in the digital age. So for 11 years, countries have taken more and more focus actually on trying to achieve these goals. And I think you probably are aware that actual performance on development around the world is pretty mixed. The best performers have tended to be in East Asia because China, Korea, and a lot of the countries of Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, for example, or Malaysia and Indonesia, have tended to make very rapid progress. And in East Asia, many or most of these goals will be achieved in many or most of the countries. The South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa have been and remain till today really the biggest epicenter of poverty, hunger, and preventable or treatable disease in the world. South Asia, of course, is dominated by India, but it also includes Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and Sub-Saharan Africa is 49 countries in the Sub-Saharan region, where poverty rates remain absolutely the highest in the world, and where until recently economic development was really stuck in most of Africa. So when you look at the broad performance of the Millennium Development Goals, broadly speaking, East Asia and Latin America, with the important exception of Haiti, have made a lot of progress. South Asia has made some progress, but it lags pretty far behind on some crucial areas, especially nutrition and child health, and also attendance in school. And Sub-Saharan Africa for a long time was really stuck in violence and war, but over the last 6 or 7 years, there's actually been quite notable progress in a lot of Sub-Saharan Africa as well, though partly because of the lost time and the greater difficulties in Sub-Saharan Africa, very, very few of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa are on track to actually achieve the Millennium Development Goals. Though I think it's probably right to say that most of Sub-Saharan Africa at this point is on track to make real progress on most or all of the Millennium Development Goals. And I think it's also true to say that most of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia and in East Asia and in Latin America are trying right now. If you go to a government report or plan, you would find that Millennium Development Goals are there, they're measured, they're reported upon, they're a matter of government concern. If you read the newspapers in these countries, day to day there would be some speech or reference to the Millennium Development Goals, whether it's going to be met or not met, and so on. So there's a real life in civil society, in government, and in the planning mechanisms to actually do something about this. So how can we judge this progress? You know, that there's been progress, the goals count, but that we're not far enough along. How do we understand this? Let me summarize the essence of the recommendations that the Millennium Project made to Kofi Annan. And most of those recommendations were actually endorsed by the UN, by the General Assembly of the United Nations in the fall of 2005. So the basic idea is that we said that with modern technology, with the big advances in almost every area of real concern for the MDGs, for example, higher agricultural productivity, better technologies for schools, better diagnostics and medicines and prevention tools for diseases, that with these advances of technology, comes an opportunity to make investments in communities, in slums, in villages, at the national and the regional scale, in order to make a big advance. I argued 11 years ago that if we would invest in controlling AIDS, for example, both on the prevention side and treating people that have the HIV infection, we would be able to curb the epidemic. Our team argued that malaria, for example, could be brought under control if we took the new technologies that are really powerful, even simple things like insecticide-treated bed nets, and the new diagnostic tests, which take a drop of blood and tell you within 15 minutes whether the child has malaria. You don't need a microscope anymore. You don't need an expert laboratory. You just need a drop of blood on a little plastic strip, something called a rapid diagnostic test. That with these new tools, you could really make a breakthrough. Now, the other side of the coin was, I argued, and of course I've been debating this for years because other people disagree with me on various points. I argued that we also needed to provide help to implement those investments, we being the rich world. My view is that a lot of the poorest countries, even if they tried, don't have the resources in their own budgets or in their own communities to be able to deploy even the basic technologies, because extreme poverty is so extreme that you don't even have the margin of survival, much less the margin you need for investment. So that was the basis on which I've been arguing that we need to increase our development aid. And my argument was not to hand over money, but actually to fund very specific, targeted investments in technology, whether it's food growing technology, school technology, disease control technology, water pumps, and cost-effective sanitation, and so on, that we should set up new funds like the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, which was an idea that I promoted to Kofi Annan, that we could then have our aid money put into these funds, and then countries could draw upon those funds in return for submissions of very serious, significant science-based programs, and that with that added funding, we'd be able to carry out the increased investments. I have a lot of critics when it comes to aid, because some people say it's all going to be wasted, it's going to be lost, it's going to be stolen, corruption makes it impossible. Some people say, you know, countries don't need the help, they should just do it on their own. Other people say, you know, screw it, why do we care? This is, we have our own problems, so we're not interested in aid. So there are lots of different attitudes. Some say that it's futile because it'll be wasted. Some say it's not needed. Some say I could care less. You know, I'm in it for myself, or our country has to be in it for ourselves. But I've taken the position that we have practical things to do. We have practical investments that can be made that can really turn the tide. And poor countries require our help. And by the way, I always referred back to the first book in economics that I read when I was a freshman at Harvard in the fall of 1972. We read a book called Partners in Development, which was by the Nobel laureate, former Prime Minister of Canada, Lester Pearson. He chaired a very important international commission around 1970 that said that there needed to be this kind of partnership like the Millennium Development Goals. So it was like the MDGs 30 years before the time. And it was Lester Pearson's commission that set the goal of 0.7 of 1% of GDP from each rich country to go to help the poor countries to scale up their anti-poverty efforts. In fact, Lester Pearson's report said the rich countries should give 1% of their income to the poor, and 0.7 of that should come from government, and 0.3 should come from civil society. That's how we got to the 0.7 of GNP goal in development aid. Well, in any event, let me quickly turn the clock forward. We made all these recommendations. We said practical things to do. Malaria could be brought under control, AIDS could be brought under control, and so on. I worked pretty hard to help establish the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria as a way to do this. I argued with everybody, it seemed, for a while, that one of the ways to do things, for example, in malaria, would be to give away an insecticide-treated bed net to every household for free, because that way we could get massive coverage of this life-saving intervention. And again, other people argued with me, no, you don't give it away, you should sell it. If they don't buy it, they won't value it. Many things were said. Finally, it was decided in 2007 that there would be a mass distribution for free of these bed nets. And in the last 3 years, about 300 million, maybe 250 million bed nets have in fact been distributed to poor households in rural Africa. So what has worked and what hasn't worked in all of this? What has worked, now let me start with what hasn't worked, because it's important to understand. What hasn't worked is the call to mobilize more international aid. It worked in a few areas, like increased funding for health, because we did get the Global Fund going. But our governments, Canada's government, the US government, most governments have been pretty resistant to the promise that they made to increase development aid. Actually, in 2002, all the governments got together in a meeting in Monterrey, Mexico, and they said that they would increase aid to 0.7 of 1%, just as Lester Pearson had asked for 30 years earlier. But basically, the ones that had been giving a lot of aid have continued to, and the ones that haven't been giving aid, by and large, have continued not to give much aid. And only a couple of countries, such as the United Kingdom, have made a significant increase of their aid levels. And then, of course, came the economic crisis in 2008 in the US, Canada, and Europe. And this has really been a terrible barrier to further progress on the aid. But even before 2008, the US was spending about 5% of GNP on the military, and it was engaged in these horrendously expensive and I think tragically destructive and wasteful wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it was only spending 0.2 of 1% of GDP in development aid. So in other words, less than a third of what it should be doing, and only 1/25 of the amount going to the military. So the US really failed this effort badly. Basically lost, I feel we basically lost the aid battle. You know, and Canada has been no great friend of this also, because Prime Minister Harper is not exactly devoted to these topics, and he's not, you know, a huge campaigner for these causes. President Obama has been basically silent on this. He doesn't think there are any votes in it, and he doesn't really lead on this. In the meantime, we've spent trillions of dollars on Afghanistan and Iraq, creating mostly disaster in my view, but in any event, this distracted us from the Millennium Development Goals. So that's the downside. The upside is really interesting, though, and that is that all over the world, civil society, that means you guys, it means the universities, it means NGOs, have really taken up the cause. And this has made a huge difference, even when governments have not acted. I still would like the extra billions of dollars, believe me, because we need it. We need it to carry out these programs. But civil society has just been absolutely unbelievable. And I think the campuses have been the most dramatic contributors to all of this, of any part of our civil society. All over Canada and the United States especially, campuses got organized, student groups, Engineers Without Borders, Unite for Sight, and different student organizations, the Millennium Campus Network, got organized to promote the Millennium Development Goals. At Columbia, at the Earth Institute, where I'm the director, we took this up by deciding to launch a development project called the Millennium Villages. And the idea was to achieve the Millennium Development Goals in those places, to learn how to do it, write code that could be helpful, create new business models for, and I don't mean for-profit business models, I mean systems models for delivery of healthcare, control of malaria, children in school, using IT, and so forth. And we've had a great time with the Millennium Villages. And I've sent you a PowerPoint. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but you can take a look, and I hope you could post it someplace so that you can have a look at it. It describes many of the innovations that we're pursuing in the Millennium Villages to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. So this is a project that covers about 500,000 people in 10 countries. And in each country, therefore, an average of about 50,000 people in a contiguous local area, where we're working with the local community to scale up the interventions to fight poverty, hunger, and preventable and treatable disease. And we're seeing, indeed, the huge potential that can come from that. And I'll say that just as the governments have been very disappointing in all of this, the positive side, which is so much more positive than I imagined, even certainly in 2000 and even in 2005, has been the technology side. Because technology just got better and better during this process, and so much better than I even dreamt it would, especially information technology. When we started the Millennium Villages, for example, in 2004, we started the first Millennium Village in Western Kenya, in a place called Sauri, near Lake Victoria in Western Kenya. And I remember I gathered the community together. There were about 250 people gathered in this school. And I asked them, how many of you have a telephone? And this was before mobile. Nobody in the whole community had a telephone. I asked them, how many of you have made a telephone call this year? Nobody. I mean, maybe a couple of hands went up in the whole room. I asked them, how many of you have ever made a phone call? And it was a scattering of hands in the room. If you go back to Sauri today and ask, how many of you have a phone, probably half of the crowd would hold up their mobile. They're everywhere now. Just complete penetration of the community. Everybody's texting. Everybody's making phone calls. And indeed, in Western Kenya, everybody's using their phones for mobile banking. A tremendous innovation called M-Pesa. Pesa is Kiswahili for money. So M-Pesa is mobile money. And it's a mobile banking system for using your phone, using Safaricom network for transferring funds, making purchases, and so forth. This has changed the life of development. The fact that communities are online, the fact that you can use SMS for healthcare, you can use, increasingly, though it's not yet quite there, wireless broadband in schools. We're on the verge of telemedicine in a number of places. This breakthrough of technology is an absolutely huge component that I didn't dream would be possible even 7 years ago that we had that meeting. We started the project 6 years ago. phones didn't play any role in our thinking of how we were going to actually achieve the Millennium Development Goals. Now I would say smartphones are at the very center of our strategy, sector by sector. So what I want to do, just to conclude right now, is to show you the map of where the villages are, and then run through a few of the technology innovations. And then let's open it up for discussion. So if you look at this PowerPoint, if you can get it up on the screen, and I'll do the same, actually, on my side. Do you have it there?
Yep, I'm just pulling it up right now.
Good, okay. Do you see the map?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, good. So that's these are where the villages are. You see the villages in East Africa are in Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, Malawi, yeah, okay, so that's the East African side. And the West African side, starting from the farthest west, is Senegal, and then we have two places in Mali. The northern one is actually Timbuktu, if you want to know where Timbuktu is, and the southern one is near a city called Ségou. And then if you can see the number 4, that's Ghana, that's near a city called Kumasi. And point number 5, if you can see that, is northern Nigeria, in a state called Kaduna State, and point number 6 is in southern Nigeria in a place called Ondo State. So you see that we have 10 countries covered and a few more sites because a couple of the countries have multiple sites. And in all of these sites, we're seeing a tremendous amount of progress. The project is integrated development, 5 key sectors: agriculture, health, education, infrastructure, meaning roads, power, water, sanitation, connectivity, and the 5th sector is business development. So it's a 5-sector integrated rural development project. And I would say that all of these sites are on track to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. The difference being that we're making targeted investments, best practice investments in these sites, and therefore they're able to move faster than the neighboring villages. But we're arguing that by showing what can be done, we then can help to accelerate the progress at the national level or even at the continent scale level. So let me show you 2 more slides very quickly. This is slide number 13 and slide number 14. What these are some of the innovations, the technologies that we are bringing to bear to help these communities to move forward. And I won't go at length. Each one is actually worthy of a whole lecture because they're quite fascinating. But in the slide 13, there are 4 of them mentioned. Shared solar is a local grid using solar power and prepay electricity. So the engineers have devised a way that households can get wired up and buy their electricity in advance the same way they buy time on their mobile phones. And indeed, they use their mobile phones to purchase, say, 1 kilowatt hour of electricity. Then you see improved cook stoves over on the top right. That is to get smokeless or low smoke cook stoves to cut down on air pollution and wood requirements. On the bottom left is called integrated soil fertility management. This is to improve the soil fertility in Africa to enable a doubling or tripling or quadrupling of the yields on smallholder farms, something that we've been able to achieve with the community, or that the community has been able to achieve with us is the more accurate way to say it. And the bottom right is called infrastructure network planning. This is an IT-based tool where you use, say, a Google Earth satellite map or some other GIS information, and you can construct, using a nonlinear mathematical programming algorithm, the best way to lay the network, or the best locations for schools, or the best locations for clinics, in order to minimize travel time and maximize access, or to minimize costs. If you go to the next slide, it's just 4 more areas, this time in the health sector. Long-lasting insecticide-treated bed nets, this is a major theme of our malaria control, the mass distribution of them. Something called Child Count Plus, that's shown in the upper right-hand corner. That's a SMS-based system so that community health workers use a mobile phone to get expert advice on how to help sick people that are visiting in their homes. And this avoids people having to come into the clinic. It allows for faster treatment of malaria. It allows for community health workers who are generally high school graduates from the villages to be able to provide advice with the mobile phone, giving them the information system that they need. The lower left-hand corner is about the CHW system. That's the community health worker system. We put a lot of emphasis on this, and if you look at our website, millenniumvillages.org, we have a recent report on scaling up community health workers. And then finally, on the lower right-hand side, is a system called verbal autopsy. Every month, some children and some adults in the community die, and use an expert system to do what's called a verbal autopsy. That means that there isn't a formal autopsy with the doctor determining the cause of death. It's an autopsy that comes from a kind of survey result where you ask the household, did the child have a fever? Was there diarrhea? Was the child coughing? And you use this kind of expert survey to determine the cause of death. And the reason why you do that is that you're trying to understand the risk factors in the community and use that information for proper management of, say, malaria control or infectious disease control, and to understand that you have an epidemic that's underway and that you need to control. And so this is, these are just 8 examples of the kinds of innovation that we're bringing to bear. And everything we're doing is open source and online, so that we're making these tools available widely. Nothing's proprietary. The whole idea is to try to diffuse these new tools and new technologies as rapidly as possible. So I don't know if the PowerPoint's still there. That's all I wanted to show on that, but everybody's welcome to have a more detailed look at the PowerPoint. There's a brochure behind it about phase 2 of the Millennium Villages project. But it shows, in my opinion, some of the best practices in order to help communities make the breakthrough. And if those communities can get some financial support in order to be able to put these innovations to use, then they can make a tremendous advance. And that's why good results in the Millennium Development Goals depend on community leadership, mobilizing best practice technologies, and mobilizing some of the financing. Not very much. In our village project, it's $60 per villager per year that we are using to make these investments. It's to mobilize that support in a systematic way to make the breakthroughs. So finally, we have 2012, 13, 14, 15, we have 4 years left. We need to make an accelerated push. I'm interested in Western Ontario and every other school getting involved in this in practical ways, in internships, in projects, in taking on villages, in being involved in the Millennium Village Project. So I'll look forward to hearing back from you on some specific ideas of what you can do. I'm really interested in campuses networking themselves across Canada and the United States, so that this is a movement that is larger than any single campus or individual. I think that this is really what the Occupy movement also is about. We just can't rely on Washington or Ottawa anymore. They're both pretty problematic. And as problematic as Ottawa is in many ways, Washington is 10 times worse. So we're trying to find ways to go around politics and get to massive civil society action. I think we can really do this, and many, many countries can come close, if not to achieve the Millennium Development Goals by 2015. I'm still holding to my words and claim in The End of Poverty, which I wrote in 2005, that we can end poverty in our generation. I said by 2025, we could end the excess deaths from these preventable diseases, we could end hunger, we could end income poverty. We waste a lot of time in this planet, so we lose time that we should be using for achieving these goals. But I think we should still hurry up, and I'm also counting on, by the way, after 2015, that there will be another 15-year period to 2030 where not to just complete the Millennium Development Goals, but to go all the way to the end of extreme poverty. So thanks very much for your time today, and thanks for what you're doing.
Okay. Thanks so much, Professor Sachs. We're gonna get underway with the Q&A session, but we will also send out the PowerPoint to everyone today. If you registered online, we probably have your email. If we don't have your email, at the end of the conference, we will be available, and we'll take note of your email and send you.
And I mean, you know, one thing I'm going to do, I'm going to send you also the brochure that this was taken from, so that if you want to show the PowerPoint, by all means use that, but I'll also send you the PDF file, the whole report, which has the words in between as well.
Okay, sounds great. Sounds great. So if there are any questions, make sure to write them down on your little cue cards. And again, our volunteer Noreen and Sharifa, Noreen will be walking around and grabbing your questions.
Although I don't know if you can do it, but I'd rather have students come up and ask them so I can just see who's asking.
You know what? That would probably be better. So why don't you, whoever has a question, probably line up in this aisle right here, and you could like maybe directly face Professor Sachs. And
and remember, if you don't ask, I'm still a professor. I get to call on you.
So I'm gonna start us off, and then you guys could like go and ask your questions. So just again, you guys can just line up in front of the computer. My question is sorry. My question is related to economic inequality is a big issue now with the Occupy movement. But my question relates to economic inequality specifically in the developing world. I wanted to know, is it a necessary step that developing countries have to go through in order to develop, or is it something that can be mitigated as a country develops?
Yeah, that's a great question. So whenever you look at economic inequality, there's always a mix of economics, market forces, and politics. And to understand inequality, you have to understand political economy. So what is driven by market forces and what is driven by politics, and especially how political power is distributed in the society. When it comes to development in, say, very poor countries, there's been a hypothesis for, I think it's, let me think, 56 years. I think it was first made by Simon Kuznets, who was a Nobel laureate, one of the great originators of modern development theory. Professor Kuznets argued that there would be a kind of inevitable rise of inequality during the development process at the start, and then inequality would go down, so like an inverted U-shaped curve. You'd start with poor people in communities, everybody more or less sharing poverty. And then he said that industrialization and urbanization would start. A small proportion of the population would gain a rise of income. Maybe that small proportion would gain access to higher education or improved skills or capital. Inequality would widen for a while as there was a kind of movement from the poor rural areas to the more advanced part of the economy. Then finally you'd reach, say, more than half of the economy in the rich sector, and inequality would start to decline again as the economy made the completion of the transition from poverty to the modern economy. So his image was an inverted U-shaped curve. And there's some evidence of that, but it's not so systematic because politics can intervene, first of all. And one of the things that politics can do, in my opinion, if politics is working well, is to invest in poverty reduction. In other words, don't only rely on market forces, but target public education, target the upgrade of agriculture, target public investments in health. And by taxing the rich and taxing the mining sector and taxing surplus sectors of the economy, and using that to invest in primary education, primary health, infrastructure, and so on, I believe that it's possible to raise the income of the poor and to speed the transition without leading to massive inequalities of wealth. The other side of the deal is a problem, which is that if massive inequalities of wealth arise, it's quite likely that the wealthy take over politics. And so the alternative danger is that the government not only fails to invest in the poor, but uses the instrument of political power to add to the wealth of the rich, in which case the inequalities are exacerbated by politics, not diminished by politics. So that's what I think progressive politics is really all about. It's adding taxation to those who can afford it to make sure that there's a faster transition for those who are still left behind. And in the poor countries, one of the most, well, let's say the three most effective interventions. Strike it. The four most effective interventions, in my view, are first in agriculture, upgrading the productivity of small farmers. Second is ensuring universal public education. Third is ensuring universal access to primary health care. And fourth is building out the basic infrastructure for the whole country.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, so you talked about your arguments on international development aid, and it can actually be argued that providing development aid, such as, for example, giving away insecticide mosquito nets, can actually be detrimental to developing economies, particularly small local businesses that may be providing similar products and services. And that also providing such aid puts the governments of these countries into a position of dependence. So my question is, how would you respond to arguments like that?
Yeah. Those are the arguments, for instance, that Bisa Moyo made in Dead Aid. I think they're really, really wrong. Very misplaced. There's nothing more terrible than having a child die of malaria. And there's nothing more terrible than having 1 million children die of malaria, which is what was happening in Africa. And it destroys families, lives, communities, and economies. And that's why we have immunization campaigns and why we need to scale up malaria control effort as well. And there were two kinds of arguments. One is the arguments that you just raised. Another was that the approach that I was recommending wouldn't work. In other words, that it wouldn't even control malaria because the nets would be stolen or misused and so on. We're actually seeing in real time malaria coming down probably by around 50% in Africa because of the massive increase of malaria control. It's actually working. Now, a lot of my critics haven't stood up and said, oh, we were wrong. But the fact of the matter is this is one of the most important breakthroughs in public health. Sad to say, almost everything that Davisa Moyo wrote that you just raised is incorrect in many ways. First, I think it's a terrible misunderstanding about mass death to let it occur anywhere. And I can't even imagine leaving my own child one night in a village unprotected by a med net. The thought would terrify me, even one day, much less leaving a continent without the tools to protect themselves. So I don't even understand the essence of it. And it was only when the world began to follow what I had been pressing for that we now have 300 million nets distributed, and we're seeing people stay alive and children stay alive because of this. But the idea of local production is also a very misplaced idea. Nothing's wrong with local production, but we have to keep in perspective making med nets. First of all, even if it were a question of local production, the question of making med nets and having a few thousand people out of Africa's 1 billion people, making them, isn't the real issue here. The real issue here is that 500 million people are at risk of death, and we need to do something about it. But the reason that it's mistaken, seriously mistaken, and people should learn their facts before they write books, is that it's not good enough just to have a med net. The med net has to be of a certain technical quality. It has to be a long-lasting insecticide-treated net. That is a very particular kind of technology. I could go on at great length because it's one of my favorite subjects, but basically the net has to last for many years. And when you allow just the markets to do this, people buy the cheapest net that doesn't even work. Because if the net isn't insecticide treated and it's not a proper long-lasting net, it doesn't even function. So people think they're getting control and protection, but they're not. There's so many other things to say, but the last point is that the nets are actually being produced in Africa. So she was even wrong on the facts. But what's being produced is the proper long-lasting insecticide-treated nets. And there's a factory called A to Z Mills in Arusha, Tanzania, which was given the technology for free by Sumitomo Chemical so that it could indeed hire a lot of people to produce the nets. The local production was actually a terrible, sad distraction because people were buying nets that fell apart, that didn't give protection, and so on. So all of this is to say, focus on the public health is the central question. How can you get malaria deaths under control? How can you control malaria? That's the challenge you should ask. And then ask the question, what's the best way to do this? My observations based on years of experience were that if we tried it the market way, we would never get the coverage. In fact, they tried it the market way. The donors loved that way, but it didn't work. Now they're trying it my way. At least it's working right now. Malaria is coming down, but even until today, there's a financial crisis at the Global Fund. So whether they will continue to fund this, I don't know. But if they open their eyes in an honest way, they would see that finally something's working in an area where there's been almost no progress for a long, long time. And your goal, always on a question like this of policy, is go for what's the most important issue. The most important issue is how to control malaria. Then look at the evidence and look at the arguments about how to do that. And also think critically, is it really such terrible dependency if we help the country with vaccines? Is that terrible? Is it terrible if we help them to distribute another 20 million med nets? What kind of dependency is that? To my mind, that's just simple, good collegiality on the planet to make a safer planet.
Thanks.
Thanks
a lot.
Hi, Professor Sachs.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Okay, so previously you suggested that more aid funding is needed, and you were citing that the current global economic situation isn't really helping that. But my understanding is that there's been a lot of lack of communication between NGOs who have been working in Africa, and so consequently a lot of the aid is either duplicated where more than one NGO does the same thing. So there's not enough understanding of what is being done where. So with that argument, wouldn't another approach be to spend the money more efficiently by perhaps having some sort of agency kind of collaborating all the NGOs together?
Yeah, definitely more NGO collaboration would be helpful. And again, one of the issues, like the Global Fund, just to give you an idea of how it works, if a country wants a malaria control program, it has to bring together all of the major malaria control organizations in the country into what's called a CCM, a country coordinating mechanism. And that whole consortium has to make the proposal. So actually, international funding can be a way to encourage, even insist upon, collaboration. So I think there is duplication, and a lot of NGOs don't use best practices and so on. But there still is a financial shortage, and if we did the financing in the proper way, like Gavi, which is the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, or the Global Fund, we'd actually be able to increase the efficiency of the use and the flow of resources in the same way. Because the NGOs are just simply, they don't have enough resources to do the job comprehensively. And so if you said to the NGO community, look, get together, coordinate, we'll provide added resources so that you can carry out these services, but we're not going to fund duplication. Then you can handle your problem and the one that I'm pointing to at the same time.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, Professor.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, good.
My name's Junaid. I'm from the University of Waterloo. In my limited experience, Professor, I've seen corruption be coupled with poverty on the lower level. But at the same time, how can we expect countries, developed countries, to give aid to corrupt countries? Wouldn't that be a little counterintuitive? Is there no way to quantify this corruption? Is there no way that corruption be tackled on the international development list? Does it not have a place there? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I sometimes say that, yes, it's true, there is corruption everywhere, not just in Washington, even in other countries as well. I think one of the things we tell ourselves is that there are corrupt poor countries and then there are well-governed rich countries, and it's nothing of the sort. The American political system is a thoroughly, utterly corrupted political system. Big money buys politics. Big money buys policies. That's one of the reasons why we've had this financial crisis, because Wall Street has run a lot of the financial regulation for years. There was huge corruption in the distribution of the rebuilding funds for Afghanistan and Iraq. One of the most corrupt countries in America in the last 20 years, I suppose, has been Halliburton, which was, it's an oil services company. It's got a string of corruption cases behind it. It also had, as CEO, as I'm sure you'll recall, one of our illustrious, in quotation marks, leaders, Richard Cheney, who is high on my list for among the worst people ever to serve in high office in the United States in our total history of the Republic. And Halliburton paid big bribes to the Nigerian government, for example, around Nigerian oil. So we should never suppose that corruption is a matter of poor countries and, you know, that we're so well governed. Corruption is a matter of our own governments and other governments. And my view is, of course, when I talk about any kind of development project, you have to be on top of these problems. And the Millennium Villages has had its own corruption inside. We have cases where things have been stolen, where money has been embezzled, and so on. Naturally. The problem is, what do you do about it? And my view is you do two big things. One is you design systems that are transparent. I am the biggest opponent of handing over money to governments. I'm not interested in handing over money. I'm interested in financing programs. I'm interested in financing bed nets. I figured out a long time ago you can't put too many bed nets into a safe deposit box in Switzerland. You can't steal them. Rather than sending money to buy bed nets, I'd rather send bed nets. That can be, by the way, locally produced bed nets. They could be sent from the A to Z Mills factory in Arusha. But still, the point is you create your systems in a way that you have goals, deliverables, monitored interventions, and this is how you keep corruption down. Second, when you see corruption, and if you have a good system, you'll see it, because you'll know the money was spent. Hey, what happened to that? We came and there were no bed nets there. You'll know that there was a diversion. We recently had a diversion of fertilizer. We traced it. We were able to reclaim it, find out who was responsible, and so on. So I think about corruption as an information systems problem, as well as a legal and ethical problem. Don't trust anybody. You don't have to trust me either. Just make sure that when you're doing something, you know what you're doing, you're putting it through a rigorous system, you can monitor and measure how things are going. Local communities have to be accountable. And this is one of the great joys of the new information technology. We can barcode the flow of merchandise. We can monitor and measure almost in real time when interventions are being carried out. We can track payrolls. We can decentralize much more easily than we could before because of information flows. So it's a real issue. And when governments are absolutely, so corrupt that you can't even make these kinds of systems, or when they say, Professor Sachs, that's all fine and good, but if you don't pay us to do this, we're not interested, then I'm out of there. And I don't recommend that we can solve the problems of unmanageable corruption in other places if you can't make the information system reliable enough to actually deliver, then don't do the aid.
Thank you, Professor.
Hi, Professor. My name is Adam. Hi.
Yeah.
My name's Adam, and I'm from the University of Waterloo. I just had you've done a lot of amazing initiatives of getting our global leaders to act together and pull resources to end poverty. But I wanted to know, how can we make our aid more effective? What are things that us individuals can do to make sure that our governments just don't focus on their foreign policies and their geopolitical interests, but look at solving global poverty at grassroots levels and the initiatives that you said? What are the things that an average student can do to get their government to be accountable? Is the solution an Occupy Wall Street sort of thing? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think that there are probably three things that quickly come to mind. One is students can make contact with your members of parliament or the members of parliament that are responsible for the aid budget and say, look, we're voters, we have a reach across this country, we're Canadian citizens, we are concerned about the levels and the direction of what you're doing. And I think that mobilization of politics like that is really important. Have student organizations unite to send a delegation to Ottawa to keep in touch, to monitor what the government is doing, and so on. Second is university-based projects that go around Ottawa that don't, maybe CETA might fund something, but even without that, you can imagine Waterloo and Western Ontario and others taking on projects to actually do real things and not being dependent on what the government is doing. The third is the Occupy movement, which is a more general kind of protest. I'm strongly supportive of this in the United States. I think our political system has really been so badly corrupted that it doesn't function for the interests of the American people, not only in this area of development aid and war, but much more generally in just about everything, in tax policy, in healthcare policy, in financial regulation, in energy policy, in climate change. We're pretty much in a disastrous situation in the United States. There's no leadership, it's only corporate lobbies, and that's why the Occupy movement, in my view, is so important. I wrote a book recently called The Price of Civilization, which is my attempt both to understand and spell out what's broken in American politics. And the last chapter was, I said, the millennials, have to solve this thing. That's you guys. I think that it's absolutely right that it's not just about foreign assistance, it's about our priorities. Climate change, for example, Canada has been pretty miserable on the climate change agenda, just like the U.S., because Canada is a big tar sands country, it's a big hydrocarbons country, and so we're just not pursuing our responsibilities. And this is where activist politics is really needed.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thanks.
Hello, Professor. Wow.
Hi.
Hi. My name is Della, and I'm from Vietnam. And I have two questions here. So should I ask at the same time, or I just state at each of that, and then you answer?
Now, I'm getting tired also because it's 11:30 at night here almost, so we're going to have to wrap up. So ask for 12:15. Sorry, past midnight. So why don't you ask the one combined question?
Okay. So my question is, the strategies to promote these programs is or even at the same time help the developing countries with low interest loan, or give them the money, or raise the awareness of those country governments so that they spend more on the goals. But there's a fact that I don't talk about corruption, but I talk about the way they manage the fund. It's not really effective. So how can you help them with that, and how can you deal with that? And one more thing is I'm just wonder because the government of the U.S. They don't really interested in helping other countries. So how can you persuade them? What is incentives? What is the benefit they see from the program that they want to deal with this, to work on this?
Thanks. So basically, when a lot of governments, for example, are coming to me right now and to my colleagues to say, can you share those tools of the Millennium Villages Project? Because governments are not only corrupt, they're also actually interested in development. And so if you have something useful to share, how to control malaria, how to mobilize community health workers, how to raise agricultural productivity, they're quite interested in it. So we're providing a lot of advice to governments across Africa, in all parts of the continent. And there's a pretty big uptake of these improved technologies. This is, I think, a part of the way to go. Governments need help. They generally don't have the best strategies inside. They don't necessarily have the best knowledge of how things can be done. And one of the roles of universities also is to help explain, devise successful projects, show new technologies, create new tools. And I think that is why I'm urging you in the campuses to do more. Get involved either with the Millennium Villages Project or with the Engineers Without Borders or similar kinds of efforts. Or choose as a campus to take on a partnership with a specific place and work with them, solve the problems, and then go to the government and say, look, we know how to do this. We can help you to scale up some of your some of these solutions. The question you asked, how to get governments more involved, is something that I've been worrying about and thinking about for a long time, and I don't have a perfect answer to it by any means, because if I did, we'd be in a much better situation. When I raised this with President Obama once, he said, well, I don't have the votes in Congress. And I was pretty disappointed with the answer, because I wanted him to create the votes in Congress through his political leadership. But I don't think he's really done that. And in Canada, the same way, the government more or less is uninterested in these issues. It doesn't realize that the Canadian people are much more interested in it, and also that there is a major problem in the United States, which is that we are much more of a Pentagon-run government than we are a development and diplomacy-run government. So the Pentagon gets $750 billion a year, and they live like potentates, the generals, and they get all the money. And the Congress stands up out of its false, I don't know if it's false, well, maybe it's not false, but it's stupid form of patriotism, and says, yes, give all the money to the generals. And of course, we just end up with these absurd wars that are so much a dead end and so painful and so wasteful, and we lose the chance to understand what's really going on. You look at where we're fighting right now. We have troops in the Sahel of Africa. This is secret, not so secret. We have troops fighting in Somalia, whether it's drone missiles or helping local insurgents. Same thing in Yemen. Of course, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan. What's common about all those areas? These are all hunger zones. This is all dryland hunger hotspots. I've been to most of that stretch, and these are places where people are living in deep poverty. Schools, clinics, farming, it's not working properly. There's a lack of hope. People are easily bought into armies, into militias, or they follow extremist leaders, and they act out of desperation. What does the United States do? It sends drone missiles. Our foreign policy approach is to kill people that we don't like. And in my view, it's an extremely narrow approach to things, because the deeper problem is climate change, hunger, water scarcity, instability of society. And we could invest at a tiny fraction of what we're spending on the military to address these problems. But, you know, this is our biggest problem. I've not been able to get past it in the United States. I'd say the situation is worse than ever. The one breakthrough that I was able to partly contribute to, together with Bono, was to interest actually the Bush administration, which was my least favorite government, but to interest them in development aid. And there it was interesting. It was the religious community, the religious constituency in the Republican Party that was the main mover of this initiative. I would never have realized what to do and how to do this. Bono played a great role. He read scriptures with congressmen, and he absolutely encouraged their religious views to play a role in calling for this kind of effort from the United States, and it definitely contributed to the U.S. programs to fight AIDS and malaria. But right now, we're even in the worst situation than ever. This is the government I voted for, the Obama administration, but we're going to see aid programs slashed and maybe even eliminated, because we're in such a mood right now of nastiness in the United States that I'm not sure what exactly is going to last, and that's why I'm really supporting the Occupy Wall Street movement, because that is going even to a more core problem, and that is the fact that our whole political process has been hijacked by corporate lobbies and by very narrow interests, and we've got to get it back. I believe, by the way, that the real values of Canadians and Americans would support an effort to end poverty worldwide. They'd see it in their own interest. They would see it as part of their own values. They'd see it as a part of making the world a safer place. But our politicians never put the question to us because they have other things on their mind.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
All right, Professor Sachs, we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much for being with us. On behalf of Smart Solutions, and I think everybody here, a big thank you. And again, I think he deserves a round of applause.